Hi guys, Tайлер Forestер for RunItOnce.com. Today we're going to be continuing my 3624 NL review session. As you know from the prior videos, if you've seen them, the live footage didn't come out very well, so I've filtered for only hands that have seen the flop. We start here with King 8 on the button, and we get faced by the small blind. This is actually a really interesting situation because Gabrici here only calls 3% of the time from the small blind, and he 3-bets about 15% of the time from the small blind. So immediately we know that most of his value hands are going to be put in his 3-betting range, otherwise he's going to end up folding way too often to 4-bets. And from past experience, if we take a look here, we're going to see that he tends to 3-bet a linear range from the small blind, from the blinds versus the button. So we see things like 10s through kings, 7s, ace 10 suited, king 9 suited, queen 9 suited. All these hands are expected in a 15% range, along with ace queen through ace 10. King jack plus has also been 3-betted in this situation by him from the small blind against the button. So this leads us to the conclusion that his most likely hand at this point in time is small pocket pairs, because we don't see them present in this range. If he was 3-betting 6s or 5s, 4s, 3s, 2s, I'd expect them to make it to showdown at some point in time. Or something like queen 10, queen jack, queen 10. Those would also be very likely hands. And I guess some of the outlier hands that he might include in this range might be something like ace-king. Some of the offsuit Broadways play pretty well as a bet or a 3-bet or a call, and he may have realized that, so he might be playing something like ace-jack or king-queen this way. King-jack, ace-10, jack-10, queen-10. So at this point in time, my range is not... I have a lot of air in my range, is the bottom line. King 8 is definitely a weak hand on this board texture, but it's also, I have a lot of weak hands on this board texture, and Gabrici doesn't have a very large folding range, because we see that he prefers to 3-bet his suited connectors in this situation, so he really never has two undercards to the board. He might have something like ace-7 of spades that folds this board, but that doesn't comprise the 43% necessary for this value for this bet to work, to be the most profitable play. So I need to develop a checking range. This hand isn't a profitable c-bet. It obviously needs to fall in my checking range. On the king, my hand has now improved substantially, although he could have something like ace-king, king-10, 4s and 2s. He doesn't like to lead out of position, so his range is going to be much flatter than the normal player here when he checks the turn to me. But even with the slow plays, I'm well ahead of his range. I could get called as lightly as 6s here. In fact, it gets close to correct, assuming he's developed a betting range out of position, that he's going to need to defend some really wonky hands to make me indifferent here, even though he's slow playing a fair bit. So he calls, and on the queen of clubs, I choose to check back this river, and the reason I check back this river is I have a hard time visualizing him calling this board texture enough with the 10 to make a bet worthwhile. There's a small chance that he chose to check call queen jack on the turn and now would call the river with the queen, or maybe he slow played ace queen pre-flop and is going to choose to call the queen. But the much more likely scenario here is that he is going to check raise me either as a bluff when he has the ace of clubs, or maybe the king of clubs even, maybe the jack of clubs. And I would fold to the raise most likely. Or he check raises me with one of the sets or 2-pair combinations that he has on this board texture. Or he calls, a better king on this river. So between those options, it's very obvious that betting here with king 8 is going to be a losing play. And so I check very quickly. He shows down king-queen. I think this gives you an indication of how he would choose to perceive the world in this situation. Even though his range is very tight and my range is very weak, he's not going to be betting out of position against me a lot. And because of that, I should be developing more of a check-back range against him. But I also need to realize that value betting the river more slimly, as this hand's probably a clear value bet in a heads-up situation. It's also a clear value bet against a lot of big blind strategies. But because his range was so tight to start with, and he slow played so often, it became a check back on the river. Here we see 5-6 of spades. Standard button open, big blind calls. We should check and see how often Mosh opens in this situation. We see that he's defending about 34% of his range as a call and about 12% of his range. That's kind of odd that he's chosen. He must be running really cold against me. 12% of his range as a 3-bet. So we know that most likely, if we look at his 3-betting range here, we'll be able to tell some things about how he plays. We'll see that he's most likely 3-betting any pocket pairs above 8. It's Ace-King, Ace-3, Queen-Jack suited, 10-9 suited, Ace-10, King-Jack. These two hands are less likely from the big blind, but they're still a possibility. So we see a pretty straightforward linear range. As his 3-betting choices, this means that on this board texture, he's not going to hit it as hard as some of the other players who have decided to bifurcate their range more, because he's 3-betting off things like Ace-10. So he no longer has Ace-10, he no longer has 10s, he no longer has aces, he may not have 7s. We see that he's 3-bet both 6s and 8s, so I have to assume that 7s is a likely 3-bet in his situation. So his hand range is really capped. We're really probably looking at the best hand he could have in this situation is a 7. It's going to make up a relatively small percentage of his 34% of hands. In fact, it's probably something like 1 in 100 he has a 7. So I should be looking to put a lot of heat on his hand range in this situation. 6-5 is a great hand to do this with because it has little or no showdown value. So I really don't have to worry about any sort of math where I go, okay, I need to think about how often I'm going to check down and win with my king high. And is that going to be more than the bluff? The fact is, I'm never winning with 6-5 on this board texture. Because I never win with 6-5 on this board texture, the only equation I need to be thinking about is how much money does my bluff win? Is it a profitable bluff? And it turns out that when his range is capped at something like Ace-7 here, that 3-barreling this hand should show a very, very nice profit. And in this particular example, we see him just folding the flop. So Gabrici here opens on the button. We check here, we see he's opening up 55% of the time. It's a very normal statistic, but I think it helps to look here because occasionally you'll find players with really wide diversions in strategy on the button. We can find players who open as little as 30% and players who open up as much as 100%. And those two strategies have drastically different counter exploitations. We're going to be playing far wider ranges against the 100% than we are against the 30%. So it always helps to look before you decide your play in the big blind. And Queen-6 of diamonds would be a play against most strategies. But the other thing I want to look at here is his fold to 3-bet number. If it's too high, I can consider 3-betting this hand. So between 3-betting this hand and calling it is our decision. I choose to call because 3-betting, he's going to make me roughly indifferent to doing it. I'd like to choose a different hand range to do it with. If I chose every suited queen, every suited jack, every suited king, every suited ace, all of a sudden I'm 3-betting 42%. I've become Nanoko. And that leaves myself open to major exploitation. Because then obviously he'll be able to 4-bet me at a very large frequency. He'll make lots of money 4-betting me because I won't be able to defend very well against the 4-bets. So if he chooses a balanced strategy that makes me indifferent to jamming Queen-6 of diamonds against his 4-bet, I really have no defense against his range, his 4-betting range. Because of all these things, calling Queen-6 of diamonds is better than 3-betting it. And on this board texture, we see that the King of Hearts, 9 of Spades, 8 of Diamonds. I like this board texture. I like to check raise Queen-6 of Diamonds on this board texture, and I like to check raise it because I'm going to turn a backdoor flush draw, some sort of gut shot straight draw, which usually you would discount, but in this situation, Gabrici is going to be expecting me to raise lots of hands like Queen 10, Queen Jack, Jack 10. Those are very common check raising hands as the big blind. And Queen 6 blocks his combinations of Queen Jack and Queen 10. So it makes it less likely that he has a hand when the Jack or 10 peels, and those cards happen to be scare cards for him. So I should get overfolds on both the Jack and the 10, and maybe the 7, and then always make money when the fourth diamond turns out. And then if we look closer at Gabrici's statistics, we find out that he has folded to the raise 7 out of 10 times in single raise pots, which isn't a big enough sample to really conclude that this is the perfect exploitation. But it's still more than probably expected. Roughly the right frequencies are around 40%, so if he's up around 70 over the sample size, he's probably either running very cold or he happens to overfold in this situation. And the other statistic we might want to look at is how often he calls versus raising against this raise. And it turns out he's never 3-bet a raise when he chooses always to call check raises in position. And because of that, that will allow us to see our equity with these backdoor draws, especially if we find a player who chooses to 3-bet our check raise aggressively. Check raising our backdoor draws doesn't make as much sense because we're going to lose all the equity and we're never going to get the chance to turn more equity on the turn, which is something this hand will do quite frequently. So I check raise here and I look like a genius. Obviously, he's not always going to fold this board texture, but I liked my reasoning here. I assume he's running cold over the sample size. What we can kind of do here to check this is I've apparently taken off the amount of money he's won over this sample size, but if he's won, say, $4,000 over this small time frame, it's much more likely that he is actually overfolding to the check raise than if he's lost a couple $1,000. Because if he's losing, he's tending to run cold. It means that that particular situations he's just being very unlucky in. Alright, 7-6 off in the small blind. We'll check here. We see that he's raising 60% on the button, which means I should be defending a very wide range out of position against a small raise. 7-6 falls pretty clearly in the profitable hand range here. I think I would probably call as low as 5-3 here, though 3-2 and 4-3 are probably cuspy hands for me in this situation, offsuit. And on this board texture, I flop nothing. We see, though, that we're going to get a free card quite a bit because he's only c-betting in position about 37% of the time. So we get our free card, and then he makes me indifferent to this bet, so I'm going to, of course, check the turn. And then since on this river card, I mentioned this in the last video, 7-6 is a pretty crummy hand. The real issue here, though, is that I don't have very many value bets. I have some ace X's, I have some 9s that slow played the turn. I'm not going to probably be able to bet a queen for value on the river. At least there's no way he's calling with like 5s here with any consistency, so I have to assume that value betting queens here is a bad play. I also need to assume that most of his checking range by the time he gets to the river is either queen X or an ace X. Most players will choose to bluff their king X's on the 9 turn. So at this point in time, he usually has a pair. It's usually above the 4. I can't make any money bluffing him, and if I chose to bluff this hand, I would be most likely bluffing too often. Because as I mentioned in the preamble to this on the flop, that I was calling things like 5-3. 4-3, although it hits a pair on this board, there's still 6-5 combinations. We still have things like 5-2 suited that's in my range, 3-2 off might be in my range. All those combinations of cards far outweigh the number of 9s I would be value betting on this river. So I check down 7-6, he shows down his 4. I probably fold the 4 on the river, but that's certainly no guarantee. Okay, so we see tag 3-bet us in the small blind here. I don't have enough of a sample really to know what he's doing at this point in time. So I'm going to default to a relatively standard strategy of calling suited broadways in this situation. King Jack suited is a suited Broadway. I'm calling it. On this King 9 3-board texture, I don't know anything about just management, but I assume that most players are betting at least some of their air on this board texture, and if they're betting most of their air, I'd assume that they would choose to balance this with a decent percentage of their nut hands. This would mean that most of his checking range at this point in time is 10s through queens, maybe some 9x, maybe some traps. So against that range, my hand fares fairly well. I choose a small bet here, basically to try to keep from being bluffed off the 10 of diamonds. Though, looking hindsight on this hand, it's very unlikely that he turns 10s through queens into a bluff on the 4th diamond. So I don't necessarily have to bet this flop, because it's very likely he's betting most of his air combinations on this flop, because I tend to 4-bet off ace-king combinations, kings, aces, and those are really the strong hands on this board texture. So my hand range does not hit this board texture very hard. I would assume that this would cause him to bet most of his air combinations, which leads us to the fact he's probably not going to bluff me on the 4th diamond. But I can always, steal a small bet here. That's, perfectly reasonable. I choose to check back the river, kind of under the hope that he would be more likely to call off lighter if the 4th diamond didn't peel and the card ended up being below 9, which is a very common situation. And then I face a bet on the river, and I end up snap calling this bet, and I must admit, I just don't like it. And it's not that generally calling top pair in these situations is a very strong strategy. You have top pair, 1 or 2 bets have went in. We have top pair, 1 or 2 bets have went in. That's about what top pair's worth, is 1 or 2 bets. So obviously calling top pair here as a general rule of thumb was a fine strategy. However, if we think back to what I was just telling you about how he usually has queens through 10s here, very few people choose to bet queens through 10s here at like 80% pot, 75% pot. So he doesn't have queens through 10s. He should have bet all his air on the flop. So I can make this ninjutsu fold that I choose not to. And so I call, of course, and I lose. And I found myself very disappointed in game about this call, because I ran through the logic that I explained to you, and I realized that my call it just wasn't very good. There was a good chance that I only had 5 or 6% equity in that pot. He would have had to have done something like check call ace queen with the queen of diamonds and then led the river, which I don't think is a very common play at these stakes. And this particular player happened to play a smaller stakes, so I would assume that he would generally be less creative in these situations, just because he would assume that people would be much more likely to call his bets, because smaller stakes games tend to play more call-y than the higher stakes games do. Okay. So we see flatting queen 10 of diamonds in the big blind, 3-betting, flatting, both are fine plays. The queen comes out. I choose not to bet this card. I was hoping it would turn a pair into a bluff. I actually don't think people do that very often on this board texture, so maybe a lead is better. It's very likely that, given our positions, he doesn't have things like Jack 9 off, and we can see this in his statistics. He's opening up 16 to probably somewhere between 16 and 18% in this situation. That range has 10-9 suited, Jack 10 suited, King Jack suited. All those hands bet the flop. So when he checks back this flop, he has a pair. He may be a type of player to check back things like 3s and 2s up to jacks, or he may be the sort of player who only checks back aces and queens. And if he chooses only to check back aces and queens, I need to be value betting, so he pays a couple of streets with his aces. He'll never be betting at a high enough frequency behind my check to make to make checking Queen 10 here the appropriate play. That being said, if he happened to see my cards face up, he would then realize that I never have queens when I check, and he should start barreling things like 8s. In practice, that doesn't happen in a high enough frequency to make checking Queen 10 here worthwhile. And then on the river, I try to regain some of the lost value of my foolish check on the turn. So we see that, at this point in time, he no longer has a queen. He no longer has a set. His range is really capped at ace X. It could be capped as high as something like ace 10 or ace jack. You do see that occasionally in players. But I'm ahead of it. And in a cap versus polar situation, I want as big a bet as I can get away with. It turns out that this bet size is probably too small. I probably should be going closer to 80 in this situation, because the only hand I'm actually afraid of here is when he spiked a 3 on the river for his set of 3s. And that's only going to happen about less than 2% of the time. So since that happens less than 2% of the time, I can choose a very large bet in this situation. If you guys are interested, at some point I'll show you the math behind these large bet sizes and why we can do them when we have so much equity, especially in these situations where I really don't have any sort of middle value range. That's a very critical part of these large bet sizes, because his range is so ace through 10. It's basically 10s through ace, like 10s through kings and ace X heavy. I really can't value bet very many aces, nor do I expect to be raised when I value bet an ace. So this gives me the ability to bifurcate my range between a very large bet when I have a queen and a medium-sized bet when I have an ace. Because there isn't a single mid-stakes player today who chooses to bluff raise this river with any frequency. In fact, it's very, very, very uncommon. And because he does not have the ability to bluff raise my bet, I can play a strategy where I can choose a larger bet size for my stronger hands, a middling bet size for my middle strength hands, and a smallish bet size for my weakest hands. The only way that is not the correct strategy is if this particular player develops a bluff raising range. But I can only name one player off the top of my head in the player pool currently who raises the turn and river at large frequencies after checking back the flop. So this player is very, very unlikely to choose that strategy, which means in this situation I should be probably betting close to $100 on this river. Somewhere between $80 and $100. And he folds pretty quickly. That maximizes my value because it allows me to bluff more often in that situation. And I really want to I should justify this a little bit more. I want to try to auto-fold ace-jack on this river. That's my goal. Because if I auto-fold ace-jack on this river, I can bluff any 2 cards here and show a massive profit. Because he only has 3s between 1 and 2% of the time at this point. So let's say I bluff at $80 here to win a $22 pot. This happens to be 4 times the amount of the pot, which means I need to win the pot 80% of the time to show a profit. If I go to $100, it becomes 84% of the time. So it slowly goes up. It goes up very slowly as it reaches those numbers. If I fold ace-jack, he's folding 98% of the time. So if I choose any bet size between $100 and even up to like $200, it's actually, I can't quite shove my whole stack in, but I think you probably still make profitable bet here if you bet like 220 here and force him off ace-jack. Because if he folds ace-jack at this point in time and you bet your $220, you're going to be able to win that pot every time you have air and show a very healthy profit doing it. And I feel like I need to justify this slightly. So, we win $220. Or we lose $220 0.02% of the time. So we lose $4. We win $22 times 0.98. So we win $21 when we win the pot And this turns out that we win $17 if we can fold ace-jack for a $220 bet. So we're gaining damn near the whole pot, even though we're betting $220 on this river for our bluffs. So making really large bluffs on rivers, especially in these situations, is incredibly profitable. Which means I need to match this with my nut hands, because I don't want to end up in a situation where he goes, oh, I've seen this player play 3 queens in this situation. He only bets $10. So what does that mean when he bets $200? He must be bluffing, I call. Because obviously if our numbers were wrong and he called the $220 bluff at, say, a 50% frequency, then we lose a lot of money. In fact, we're going to lose almost $100 by betting $220 here. So to make that sort of exploitation much harder, I'm going to choose to bet the same amount with my nut hands as I do my bluffs, even though I expect my nut hands to get paid off very rarely, because I'll make all the money back on the extra bluffs. Because it's much, much more common for me to have something like Jack 9 in this situation than it is for me to have a queen. And I say all this and I've been checking back 7-6. I don't know if this was one of my finer sessions. But I think it's really interesting to go over it and see what I did right and what I did wrong. Really, the key part of playing poker is being able to review your sessions and being critical of what worked and what didn't. Because things change over time, and really the ability to learn playing poker is the part that's going to make you better than your opposition, which ends up ultimately making you the most money. So we're now working onto this 4-bet pot. I'm going to 32 here. Mosh min raises me. We've seen this. I've seen this before from him. It turns out he does like to 4-bet in position fairly frequently. It is a strategy choice where he does have some bluffs, but most of his range is value. He ends up with jacks or better here for value, and then a combination of bluffs. We see that he might take ace-9 off here. If we look at the 4-bet hands he's 4-betted and showing down, we see things like ace-6 suited, ace-9 suited, 5-4 suited, ace-9, ace-king. On the button, he's going to be flatting ace-6 suited and ace-9 suited and 5-4 suited, so that leaves us with his most likely bluffing hands are things like ace-9. Possibly ace-8 as well. We can look at those numbers, or you can do it on your own. You'll find out that a jacks through aces, ace-king off range, plus ace-9 off, ace-8 off is going to be roughly 4% of the time. Or a 4% range here, which ends up being about 14% of the time. I should learn better. Just never do math during videos. Well, on film, do not do math. Alright, so this leaves us in a situation where 6s is not a great hand. Because obviously it's behind his range substantially. That being said, we have to pay $40 to win a $153 pot. So I'm getting 3-to-1 immediate odds, and then I will always flop a set. I'm going to flop a set and win the pot 10% of the time. So if I can find some situations, maybe like this board, where he's going to check back ace-king and we check down and I win with 6s, that's going to be enough to show a profit flat calling 6s to the 4-bet. It'll always be an awkward situation, but it should lose less than the 8 big blinds that I've already invested in the pot. And of course I'm not bluffing on this board texture. It crushes his range. It doesn't do very much for mine. If we look at his only bluffing combinations like ace-8, ace-9, they've now hit the river. So I have really no hope of winning the pot but as a bluff. And he shows down ace-king, which is actually an excellent outcome for us, because we got a lot of free cards against a hand that might normally force us to fold that flop. So here we're playing against Babooner. He happens to be a recreational player. We can tell this here by the 54% VPIP and the 17% raise. He limps in the small blind. I choose to raise 5-4 suited here. This raise is probably not the best option against this particular player because he doesn't fold enough to justify bloating the pot with a hand that's behind every hand in his range, essentially. Against a player who plays most hands, 5-4 suited does really poorly against him. Most of our equity comes from 5-4 suited maintaining constant equity against an entire range of hands. Because 5-4 suited has the same equity against the top 50% as it does roughly against the top 15%. So we can raise it without any loss of equity, which makes raising it a better play against most players because we end up with our fold equity, and then when we see the flop, we have the same amount of equity we started with. So in some sense, it's a semi-free bluff. On this board texture, we see the 7 of diamonds, the 6 of spades, the 2 of spades, the 5-4 of hearts. With the straight draw, I'm going to be barreling here significantly. I don't have a sense of how he plays faux flop yet, so I want to default to some sort of balanced GTO strategy. The best way to do that is to barrel my lowest draws. So we'll see me barrel 3 times here, barring some very odd turn river outcome. The Queen of Spades ends up having to be just an amazingly powerful card for my range, but Booner's going to have folded most of his Queen X's when I bet the flop, and he doesn't have that many spade draws in his range, so it becomes very hard for him to call things like Ace-3 again on the turn, or even something as strong as, say, Ace-6. Because he most likely has things like Ace-2, Ace-6 in his range, this makes this bet very profitable, even if I didn't have 5-4. With 5-4, it's a slam dunk bet. Okay, 10-9 off is a standard open in the small blind. Some of the smarter players at this point in time are starting to develop limping strategies in the small blind. I like the idea of a limping strategy in the small blind. However, it doesn't play very well in game yet because you have to play a very complicated mixed strategy with most of your hands. Because the upper division hands tend to lose money by limping here. So you have to develop a strategy that makes both the player indifferent to raising your bet and a strategy that makes sure it maximizes value with your entire range. And so that means that the correct strategy out of the small blind here is going to be some sort of limping strategy plus some sort of raising strategy. And I'm not sure if anyone knows what the right balance is at this point in time. We see a small bet here again by me. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that hypothetically, his range is wider than mine in the big blind. It turns out that it's probably not. We see that he's managed to fold 5 out of 8 times. Actually, I should check this. He may have 3-bet some of those combinations. Okay, good. So he's only... Let me make sure I have this right. So he is... Interesting. So it turns out that this statistic has 8 samples, and it says that he's called 3 out of 8 times. Then we go up here and we look at the 3-bet versus the small blind. That only has 4 samples, and he's 3-bet once. This presents issues for trying to do this quickly. He's defending about half the time in the big blind. And I think that because he's 3-betting off the stronger ends of his ranges, that I have a slight equity advantage on this board. I want to take advantage of it with making small bets out of position to try to force him to fold things like Queen 4 here that might turn a pair or turn some equity. Because every hand in his range is going to have some equity against top pair on this board texture, I believe. I guess 9 deuce doesn't, but it's just like 90% of his hands have some equity against top pair. So I'll use this small bet as a protection / value bet. I'd hope to see myself bet this turn because he doesn't have a lot of jacks in his range, and I want to put a lot of pressure on his 6s and 3s and some of his Ace-4 floats, which he needs to have in this range. Because his correct strategy in position here is to either call or raise 75% of the time to this smaller bet. So he does not have, he just has a lot of very weak hands, and I should be putting a lot of pressure on those weak hands to try to force him to fold. And if I choose to check things like top pair here, then I cannot put the same amount of pressure on those weak hands as if I bet it. Because by betting top pair, that allows him not to be able to read my hands. It ends up being analogous to the situation with the 3 queens. Even though top pair here is probably not a great value bet, because most players aren't calling things like ace-3 to the bet here, it is a great bet because it allows me to balance all my bluffs without the fear of exploitation, or easy exploitation, as I should say. Because Grind Wizard, if he sees me checking top pair, he becomes far more likely to hero call the, an ace-6 or an ace-3 type hand to a bet here, because he knows that he no longer has to worry about 10-9 in my range. So you see me check here, and of course I'm calling. The call here is pretty clear. It's obviously well up into my range. I beat most of his hands at this point in time, assuming he's called even remotely close to the right frequency on the flop. And the King of Diamonds comes out. At this point in time, you won't see very many players bet things like Queen 10 again on the river. I'm not sure if betting Queen 10 is correct, but people don't do it. So we can strip out hands like Queen 10 in this situation. We probably can even strip out Ace 10. Which leaves us in the situation where he either has 2 pair or better, which is going to happen at a reasonably fair frequency, or the backdoor flush. Or something like King 9, I guess, is possible as well. I'd actually expect King 9 to be a value bet here. Maybe King 8, too, if he was a little bit looser in this situation. So if we assume he has something like King 9 or better in this situation, he's going to struggle to balance that with his bluffs, because he ends up with 7-5 off, 5-4 off, 8-7 off, 9-8 off, 9-7 off. That's way too many combos of bluffs. So if he has all those bluffs, he needs to check back some fraction of them. I assume that on the King of Diamonds river, he would not be checking back those bluffs, that he would view that as a scare card for a 10. Because if we look at this board texture, both the Jack and the King are above the 10 now. There's a 3 flush out. That's kind of scary. It's really not, though, because he has so many combinations of gut shots that missed on the river. So I have a relatively easy call here with 10-9. I don't need to be too worried about balancing here, that I'm going to be able to be super exploited by calling 10-9 here, because I should be barreling so frequently on the turn that this is kind of an outlying hand, and it's well up into the top end of my range. As we've seen in my previous videos, I'd oftentimes check call things like ace-3 here, ace-6 here, 3-2 here. If I chose not to bet ace-king, I'd be check calling it. This puts 10-9 very high. It's very high up in my range. I'm probably in the top, 30% of my range. And I need to be calling here almost 60% of the time to make him indifferent. So this becomes an unexploitable call from his perspective, and it should be a profitable call from my perspective. So anyhow, thanks folks for listening. I'll be back in a couple of weeks.